Spring arrived like it always did in the West. Quietly at first, then all at once. Grass pushed through dry soil, trees dusted the air with yellow pollen, and the world around Marcus's small property seemed to breathe again. Titan didn't change overnight. He didn't suddenly forget the kill pen or the years that carved hard lines into his soul. But slowly, painfully slowly, the stallion began stepping into his own kind of spring. A month after the panic in the driveway, Titan started watching Marcus instead of turning away. Not constantly, not even often, but just enough for Marcus to notice. When Marcus walked into the barn humming, Titan would raise his head. When Marcus paused outside the stall door, Titan's ear would tilt. These tiny shifts weren't dramatic, but to Marcus they were monumental. The kind of progress you measure in heartbeats, not miles. Still, the guilt stayed with him. Some mornings it felt heavier than the feed bucket he carried. Other mornings it felt like a shadow attached to the soles of his boots. He'd walk into the barn whispering quiet promises to a horse that didn't owe him anything. "You're safe. I'm here. I'm not selling you again. Ever." And even though Titan couldn't reply, his slow, cautious exhale often felt like the closest thing to forgiveness Marcus would ever receive. But the world beyond the barn wasn't ready to forgive Marcus so easily. The article he'd written, the one he titled The Price of Convenience, How I Destroyed the Horse I Loved, had spread farther and faster than he expected. Some people praised him for admitting the truth. Others crucified him for it. His inbox flooded. His phone buzzed at all hours. His name was dragged across online forums he didn't even know existed. At first, Marcus tried to ignore it. After all, Titan needed him more than strangers' opinions ever could. But some criticisms hit harder than the rest. "I would never forgive someone like you. He abandoned that horse. Why does he get a second chance? He only wrote the article to look good." And the one that cut deepest, "You can't undo 5 years of suffering. Don't kid yourself." Marcus didn't answer any of them. What could he say? They were right. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't take back that handshake, that contract, that check. Couldn't erase the nights Titan went hungry, the hands that mistreated him, the pens he was shoved from, the strangers who saw him as nothing more than a piece of equipment. But Marcus could do one thing. He could make sure Titan never lived another day in fear. And that meant taking the heat, accepting the blame, bearing the anger. It was the cost of what he'd done, a cost he deserved. 2 months after the article, a knock came at Marcus's front door. When he opened it, Dr. Chin stood on the porch with her vet bag in hand, not for an appointment, but for something else. "You've started something," she said. Marcus blinked. "What do you mean?" She stepped inside, brushing dust off her jacket. "Other trainers are talking. Rescue groups, even some ranchers. Your article, it forced a conversation people don't like having." "Yeah," Marcus muttered. "I've seen the comments." "I'm not talking about the online noise," she said. "I'm talking about the impact." She explained how several young trainers reached out wanting advice on how to track the horses they sold. A small rescue in Nevada wanted to collaborate on a database. One ranch owner emailed her asking about Titan's recovery plan after reading the article. For the first time, Marcus felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but a sense that maybe his failure could become a warning that saved others from repeating it. "People aren't going to like you," Dr. Chin said bluntly. "Some of them never will. But they're listening. Whether they admit it or not, they're listening." Marcus swallowed. "I don't need them to like me." "No," she agreed. "But Titan needs you to keep going." And so he did. He built what would later be known as the Titan Protocol, a system of accountability requiring trainers to follow up on horses they sold for a minimum of 5 years. It was optional, purely voluntary, but it was strict. It demanded records, contacts, welfare checks, and transparent buyer histories. Some folks called it idealistic nonsense. Others said it was impossible to enforce. Yet, little by little, trainers began joining. 5 in the first month, then 12, then 50. Within a year, more than 300 trainers adopted it. Mostly younger ones, but enough to make a difference. Enough to build a network big enough to notice when a horse went missing. And enough to save others from slipping into the same darkness Titan had survived. But none of that made the relationship between Marcus and Titan magically heal. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was a crooked trail full of switchbacks, the kind cowboys use when climbing steep mountains. Some days, Titan let Marcus groom him without a single flinch. Some days he pinned his ears when someone else walked by. Some days he rested in the pasture, eyes half-lidded in quiet peace. Other days, he paced at shadows only he could see. Trauma, Marcus learned, didn't disappear. It simply became something you learned to live beside. 8 months after rescue, something changed. It happened on a calm evening. The sky painted gold, the barn wore with the smell of fresh shavings. Marcus was mucking Titan's stall, lost in thought, when he felt a breath warm against the back of his neck. He froze. Slowly, he turned. Titan stood right behind him, head low, eyes softer than Marcus had ever seen them since the kill pen. The stallion studied his face for a long moment, a quiet, searching moment, then stepped forward and rested his heavy head gently on Marcus's shoulder. The same old gesture Titan used to offer years ago. The gesture that once meant trust. Marcus's eyes burned. His throat tightened. He lifted a trembling hand and placed it on Titan's neck, feeling the warmth of life, the weight of all the things they'd survived. "I'm here," Marcus whispered. "I'm still here." Titan exhaled, long, slow, and deep. A release. A surrender. Maybe even forgiveness Marcus would never believe he deserved. And for the first time in years, Marcus let himself breathe. Time went on. Titan remained skittish with strangers, stubborn with new routines, distrustful of the world beyond his pasture. But with Marcus, he softened. He grazed near him, followed him at a slow walk, allowed him to groom his neck and shoulders without stiffening. The scars didn't vanish. Neither did the memories. But the bond, the one they once lost, grew back, not as it was, but as something different. Stronger, slower, born from pain and patience instead of training and talent. Titan didn't forget. Marcus didn't expect him to. Some stories don't end with perfect forgiveness. Some end with something quieter, something humbler. Acceptance. One cool morning, years later, Marcus watched Titan run across the pasture. Not fast, not flashy, just free. The sun caught his coat, gleaming over scars that told the story better than any documentary ever could. Titan slowed, trotted over, and lowered his head so Marcus could rest a hand against his neck. "You're safe," Marcus said softly. "For the rest of your life, you're safe." Titan breathed warm air into Marcus's palm. Not forgiveness, not erasure, but peace. And sometimes in the Wild West, in life, peace is the greatest redemption a man can earn. William continued, quieter now, but with a weight that filled the room. "She's been through hell this year. She stood strong, carried more than anyone sees. And still, you chose to belittle her." Camilla exhaled slowly. "I didn't mean—" "But you did," he said. Silence followed. Heavy, unbearable, electric. The guards outside stood frozen, their bodies still, but their thoughts racing. They would never repeat what they heard, but they would never forget it either. Finally, Camilla spoke, her voice thinner than before. "I'll be more mindful." It wasn't an apology, and both of them knew it, but it was the closest she was willing to come. She stood, smoothing her skirt, walked to the door, placed her hand on the handle, and just before leaving, she said quietly, "Your mother would be proud of you." Then she stepped out. The guards didn't move, didn't blink. Not even when William remained standing in the center of the room, breathing hard, realizing nothing about the palace would ever be the same again. The blue drawing room had gone silent again, but not peacefully. It was the kind of silence that clings to the walls long after voices fade, a silence that remembers. William stood at the center of it, his breath steady but deep, like someone who had just walked through the edge of a storm. And outside that door, the royal guard stood motionless. Yet every one of them felt the shift, because when a future king speaks with that much conviction, the palace doesn't simply hear it. It absorbs it. But the confrontation wasn't over. Not really. As Camilla stepped out into the hallway, her ladies-in-waiting practically straightened themselves at the sight of her face. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply lifted her chin, adjusted her pearl collar, and walked to the posture of someone determined not to let emotion stain the surface. The guard said nothing, but several exchanged the quickest glance, a violation of their training, but human instinct is stronger than protocol. One thought echoed among them. This is going to ripple through every corner of the palace. Inside the room, William finally moved. Not toward the door, not toward help, not toward escape. He walked to the window, fingers brushing the cool glass. It grounded him, steadied the pounding beneath his ribs. He wasn't shaking with rage anymore. Now the emotion was heavier, deeper, something closer to sorrow. He expected the confrontation to bring relief. It didn't. It brought responsibility. And responsibility was far heavier than anger. Just then, a voice approached behind the door, soft, respectful. "Your Royal Highness, may we enter?" William turned slightly. His private secretary and a senior aide stood waiting for him. The prince nodded once, and they stepped inside, closing the door behind them with quiet reverence reserved for sacred places. "Sir," the senior aide began carefully, "word of the discussion has already reached parts of the East Wing." "Of course it has," William murmured. "Nothing in this palace stays contained." His secretary met his gaze. Staff are concerned. Some are relieved, and others confused. William didn't respond immediately. He hated the idea of palace gossip, but he hated something else even more. The thought that Catherine had been enduring whispers and subtle stabs without anyone stepping in. And he hated that he hadn't spoken up sooner. "Sir," his secretary continued, "you did the right thing." William's eyes lifted sharply. "Did I?" The man nodded. "Yes, sir. Every single person here knows how much the princess endures. They see it. They hear it. And many have wished someone would say something." That struck William harder than he expected. He wasn't alone in seeing the cracks. But cracks in the palace are dangerous things. They spread, and once exposed, they demand attention. William dismissed the staff with gratitude, then took a long breath. This wasn't just a confrontation between two people. It was a collision between two eras, between an old guard and a new one, between the monarchy that hid its wounds and the one that refused to let history repeat itself. He stepped out of the room, and that was when the second confrontation began. Not with Camilla, she was gone. With Charles. William didn't have to search for his father. A footman hurried toward him immediately, bowing slightly. "Sir, His Majesty requests your presence in the Lancaster room." Of course he did. William followed the footman through the hallway lined with ancestral portraits. The kings in oil paint seemed to stare down at him, not judgmental, not approving, just watching, waiting. When William entered the Lancaster room, Charles stood at the far end, hands behind his back, staring at the antique clock on the mantel as if it might give him answers. He didn't turn when William walked in. "Close the door," Charles said quietly. William obeyed. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt heavier than before, thicker, as if even the air understood what had just unfolded. Finally, Charles turned. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired, deeply tired. "William," he began softly, "I've just spoken with Camilla." William held his ground. "I expected you would." Charles walked closer, stopping a few feet away. "She is upset. So is Catherine." That reply hit the room like a quiet thunderclap. Charles exhaled slowly through his nose. "You put me in a very difficult position." "No," William said, voice steady. "Camilla did that. I simply refused to let her disrespect my wife." Charles's gaze sharpened, not in anger, but in something like frustration mixed with wounded pride. "William, this family cannot afford open conflict right now. This family cannot afford silent cruelty either." Charles blinked, surprised by the force of the words. "It was one comment," the king said softly. "No," William said. "It was the one I refused to ignore." The king studied his son for a long, tense moment, as though searching for the boy he raised somewhere beneath the future king he was shaping. But William wasn't bending, not this time. "You sound like your mother," Charles finally whispered. That sentence wasn't a jab, wasn't a wound. It was an admission. William swallowed. "I learned from her." and from how she suffered. Charles's shoulders slumped just slightly, as if that truth weighed more than any crown. "You know I never wanted her to suffer," he murmured. "I know," William said quietly. "But knowing isn't enough anymore." For the first time in the entire exchange, Charles broke eye contact. He looked down at the polished floor, then at the clock again, then back at William. "What do you expect me to do?" the king asked. William spoke without hesitation. "Protect Catherine, the way I protect Camilla." Charles inhaled deeply. "Camilla says she will be more careful." "That's not enough," William replied. What she said hurt Catherine, and it wasn't the first time. The king's expression changed then, a flicker of realization or dread crossing his features. "You've been holding this in for a long time." "Yes," William said. "Too long." Charles nodded slowly, almost painfully. "I see." There were 1,000 things William could have said next, but he didn't. He'd said what mattered. And Charles needed time. Time to understand the full impact of the fracture forming beneath his own roof. Charles walked to the window, staring out over the gardens. "I'll speak to her," he finally said. William nodded once. "Thank you." As he turned to leave, Charles called after him, "William." He stopped. Charles's voice softened. "Your mother will be proud." William didn't trust himself to speak, so he only nodded. Then he left the room, closing the door gently behind him. And in the hallway, as he walked past the silent guards and the watching portraits, one truth settled inside him. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a beginning, a line drawn, a shift in the monarchy, a warning that respect inside the palace was no longer optional. William had stepped into the fire, and he wasn't backing away. Some dinners inside royal walls looked perfect on the surface. Polished silver, crystal glasses, menus handwritten in looping calligraphy. But not every beautiful table is peaceful. And on this night, that dining room felt like a stage waiting for a storm. It was supposed to be a small, private family meal. Just Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine. 4 people. 4 titles. For different kinds of tension simmering under the same chandelier. William and Catherine arrived first. They walked side by side, but the air between them felt heavier than usual. Not because of each other. They were united, but because they both knew what this dinner represented. It wasn't a meal. It was a test. A measure of whether the confrontation earlier could be quietly buried, or whether it would ignite something larger. As staff guided them into the room, William squeezed Catherine's hand gently. She returned the gesture, but her face showed a hint of worry. Soft, controlled, but real. The table was immaculate. The kind of beauty only royal households know how to create. White linen so crisp it looked like untouched snow, polished utensils aligned with precision of military ranks, and candles flickering as if they understood the mood they were about to illuminate. Seconds later, King Charles entered. He wasn't smiling. His expression held the same restrained tension William had seen earlier in the Lancaster room. But his voice was neutral as he greeted them. "Good evening." William nodded. Catherine curtsied slightly, gracefully. There was a moment, small but unmistakable, when Charles seemed to search his daughter-in-law's eyes, as if trying to convey something unspoken. Regret? Guilt? Or a father's apology he didn't know how to phrase. "Camilla will be down shortly," he said. Those words lingered in the air like a warning. And then the door opened again. Camilla entered the room with the posture of someone determined to look composed, even if her heart was anything but. She wore deep blue, pearls resting softly against her collarbone. Her expression was polite, but her eyes were guarded. Too guarded. "Good evening," she said, her tone smooth but lacking warmth. "Good evening," Catherine replied, matching her politeness exactly. They all sat, and the dinner began. The first course arrived, a delicate consommé that would normally spark compliments. Tonight, it sparked silence. The only noises were the careful clinks of silverware and the faint hum of the palace beyond the walls. Charles tried to lighten the atmosphere. "So, the charity gala next month," he began. "Yes," William said politely. "We're reviewing final details." "Wonderful," Charles replied. "It's always important to—" His voice faltered, because even he could feel the emptiness in the conversation. They weren't talking. They were avoiding. And avoidance only stretches so far before truth demands space. By the second course, the tension grew heavier. Even the staff, trained to move like whispers, slowed slightly, as if afraid to interrupt a fragile peace. Then, quietly, Charles placed his fork down with just a little too much force. The sound echoed. "This is ridiculous," he said. The room froze. "We're sitting here pretending everything is fine when clearly it is not." William looked up. Catherine's breath tightened. Camilla's shoulders stiffened. "Perhaps," Charles continued, his voice strained, "we should address what happened instead of dancing around it." William responded calmly. "I agree." Camilla inhaled sharply, as if preparing for impact. Charles turned to his son. "Then explain to me why you felt it necessary to confront the Queen Consort in the way that you did." William didn't flinch. "Because she crossed a line." "It caused a stir," Charles said. "A divide." "The divide was already there," William replied. "I simply stopped pretending it wasn't." Camilla finally spoke. Her voice clipped. "I did not intend to be cruel. My comment was misunderstood." Catherine slowly set her glass down. "With respect," she said softly, but with unmistakable firmness, "I heard what you said, Camilla." Camilla blinked, surprised that Catherine, usually so gentle, was stepping forward. "And it didn't feel like concern," Catherine continued. "It felt like mockery. Silence. The kind that weighs so heavily it almost becomes sound." Camilla's lips parted, but no words came. Catherine held her gaze, calm but unwavering. It was not aggression. It was truth, and that truth had been buried long enough. Charles looked between the two women. Conflict etched painfully across his face. He loved both, child and wife. And for the first time, he seemed to realize that the gap between them wasn't just emotional. It was structural. "Camilla," he said softly, perhaps your words were not as careful as they should have been." Camilla's eyes widened, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the sting beneath her composure. "Charles," she murmured in disbelief. "I'm not condemning you," Charles said quickly. But clearly Catherine was hurt, and intent does not erase impact. It wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't siding with William. It was the closest thing to fairness Charles had managed in years. And in that room, fairness mattered. William leaned slightly forward. "This isn't about winning an argument. It's about respect. Catherine has endured more than most people know. She shows grace every day, even when the world pressures her. The least she deserves is kindness inside this family." Camilla swallowed, her throat tightening slightly. For a moment, she wasn't the queen consort. She was simply a woman realizing her role in someone else's pain. She began, voice thinner. "I understand." Catherine nodded softly, a gesture of quiet acceptance, but not surrender. "Good," Charles said gently. "Then, perhaps we can move forward." But moving forward in the royal family is never simple, and everyone in that room knew it. The rest of the dinner continued quietly, cautiously. Not warm, but no longer ice. A fragile truce, held together by necessity and the shared understanding that too much was at stake. When the final course was finished, Camilla stood. "If you'll excuse me," she said quietly, "I believe I'll retire for the evening." Her exit was calm, but her footsteps carried a heaviness the walls would remember. Charles excused himself moments later, chasing after her, not out of anger, but out of concern. And suddenly William and Catherine were alone at the glowing, empty table. Catherine looked at him, her eyes softer now. "Do you think any of this will help?" she asked quietly. William reached across the linen and took her hand. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know one thing." "What's that?" "We won't stay silent anymore." Catherine exhaled. A small, grateful smile touched her lips. They sat there for a moment, just the two of them, in a palace full of pressure, holding each other's hands, finding strength where it mattered most. Outside, the guards resumed their steady watch. But even they sensed it. Something in the royal household had shifted. A truth had been spoken. A boundary had been drawn. and dinner had not healed the fracture. It had exposed it. Buckingham Palace may look unshakable from the outside. Stone walls, tall gates, guards who never blink. But inside, the air was different after that dinner. Something subtle but unmistakable had shifted, like a painting slightly tilted on the wall. Most people wouldn't notice it, but those who lived there felt it instantly. For decades, the royal household had survived on routine rituals and quiet obedience. But that quiet was broken now, not by scandal in the press, not by public drama, but by truth spoken in a small, candlelit dining room. The next morning, staff moved cautiously through corridors that suddenly felt tighter. In the kitchens, the head chef whispered to the pastry team. "In all my years," he murmured, "I've never seen His Majesty look so conflicted." In the security office, two senior guards exchanged glances. "It's the first time I've seen the prince stand up like that," one admitted. He meant every word. The other replied quietly, and he wasn't wrong. Whispers traveled. Not loud, not disrespectful, but thoughtful. People in the palace always noticed more than the family realized. They noticed when voices trembled, when smiles looked forced, when kindness felt like a performance. And now they noticed something else. Prince William had drawn a boundary, a real one, and boundaries inside royal walls echo louder than arguments. Meanwhile, Camilla had retreated to her private chambers. She had 2 canceled engagements, officially due to fatigue, unofficially due to the emotional blow she didn't want anyone to see. For hours, she stayed behind closed doors. Her advisor, Margaret, stepped inside gently. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Camilla didn't respond at first. She stood near the window, staring out at the palace gardens. The same gardens Diana once walked. The same gardens that had silently witnessed 1,000 unspoken tensions. Finally, she said quietly, "I didn't expect William to confront me like that." Margaret folded her hands. "He's protective of Catherine." "I know he is," Camilla said, "but I thought after all these years, I had earned a certain understanding." "You have," Margaret replied softly, "but even understanding has limits." Camilla turned, her expression caught somewhere between frustration and something deeper, hurt. "I never meant to harm her," she whispered. Margaret nodded. "But intent isn't what people remember." Camilla closed her eyes for a moment. The crown brought power, but it also brought scrutiny from the public, from the press, and now from within the family itself. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone who had once looked at her like a second mother. She didn't say it aloud, but the truth lingered in her chest. She had underestimated William's loyalty and Catherine's quiet strength. Across the city at Kensington Palace, Catherine moved through her morning routine with practiced calm. Meetings, briefings, charity updates. Everything looked normal. But inside her private sitting room, her thoughts circled back to the confrontation. Her secretary Emma noticed. "You're quiet today," she said gently. Catherine smiled faintly. "Just thinking." "About last night?" Catherine nodded. "It was a lot." Emma hesitated before speaking. "If I may, you handled it beautifully." "I didn't want conflict," Catherine said. "I never do." "I know," Emma replied. "But sometimes conflict finds us when someone crosses a line we can't ignore." Catherine looked down at her hands. Elegant, steady, but tired. "For years," she said quietly, "I tried to be gracious no matter what, to rise above everything. But when William spoke up, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time." "What was that?" Emma asked. "Relief." Later that afternoon, King Charles summoned William to Clarence House. The room was quieter than usual when William entered. The curtains were half drawn. A single lamp cast a soft glow over the antique furniture. Charles stood near his desk, hands resting on a letter he hadn't finished reading. He didn't look angry. He looked older. "William," he said softly, "thank you for coming." William nodded. "Of course." Charles gestured for him to sit. He didn't sit himself, not yet. He walked to the window, his shoulders carrying the weight of monarch, father, and husband all at once. "I've been thinking," Charles began slowly, about everything that happened. William waited. I spoke to Camilla, the king continued. She admits she chose her words poorly. She regrets how they were received. William didn't answer immediately. That wasn't an apology, but it was progress. I'm not asking you to forget what happened, Charles said, but I am asking you to remember one thing. What's that? William asked. This family is fragile, more fragile than the world will ever know. And if we fracture from within, everything we stand for begins to crumble. William lowered his eyes. He understood the burden of the crown better than most. I know, he said quietly, but protecting my wife isn't fracturing the family. It's preserving it. Charles turned, studying his son's face. A mix of pride and sadness settled in his eyes. You become stronger than I ever was at your age, he said, and fiercer. William swallowed. I learned from what happened to Mom. The room fell still. Charles nodded, just once. She would be proud, he said softly. For a moment, the roles of king and heir disappeared. They were simply father and son, two men carrying a legacy shaped by love and pain. That evening, William returned home. Catherine was in the garden again, watching their children play beneath the fading light. William paused at the doorway, taking in the sight, the laughter, the grass-stained knees, Catherine's gentle smile. This was his real kingdom. This was what he was fighting for. He walked toward her. She looked up, the hint of a question in her eyes. How did it go? She asked. It went, he said with a faint smile. And I think it helped. She exhaled, relieved. William sat beside her on the bench, leaning slightly so their shoulders touched. You know, he said softly, I wasn't just defending you last night. Oh, she asked. I was defending the future. Catherine's expression softened. Our future? Exactly. She rested her head on his shoulder. The garden was peaceful, lit by sunset and children's laughter. For a moment, the world felt simple again. What happens now? She whispered. William watched their children, running, tumbling, shouting with joy. Now, he said, we move forward, stronger, together, and with boundaries no one dares cross again. Catherine laced her fingers with his. And just beyond the hedges, royal guards continued their silent patrol, unaware that tonight their watch was guarding more than a palace. They were guarding a family slowly reclaiming its voice, a marriage strengthened by truth, and a future king who finally chose to confront the shadows instead of living beneath them. Because sometimes the most powerful moments inside Buckingham Palace don't happen during coronations or ceremonies. They happen in quiet rooms, behind closed doors, when someone decides.